Hey guys, I'd like to thank Ian for sending in this question, which I'm going to do a video response for. This question was posted on the iNuke 6000 video, and the question is, I'm using a Behringer iNuke 6000 with DSP, and why aren't my vocals loud enough? The scenario, as I understand it, from the question posed, is I'm in a band. We have a 2-space garage that we're practicing in. I'm using a 15-watt guitar amplifier and standard band setup. And I've got a small PA system comprised of an iNuke 6000, which is driving a PV Scorpion 800-watt speaker. And on the input side of it is a microphone going to a small mixer into the power amp. Pretty straightforward. And when the band is playing and practicing, they can't get the vocals loud enough. They can't get the vocals up over the guitar. And it's just a 15-watt guitar amp. What's going on? Do I need a better mixer? Okay. Good question. And I'll start off by saying that I've used the iNuke 6000 power amp. It's something over 1,000 watts per side in reality. And you're probably not going to get a whole lot more power amp that can be plugged into a standard wall circuit that'll deliver a lot more power. So I don't think the answer is a bigger, better power amp. It should have plenty of power. And I've used those amplifiers for many band events, and I've covered spaces that are much bigger than a 2-car garage successfully. So the amplifier should be able to deliver adequate output to keep up with the band. I'll make a general sound guy statement here, which is I get the joy of practicing loud, banging into the drums like Godzilla, diming the amplifiers, shaking the walls, and tearing it up. Great times. However, I would question the wisdom of it. It depends on what your goals are. But if your goal is to be a successful, commercially viable performing band, my advice would be to strive to practice quietly and pull the band together and have a meeting and talk about what your goals are. But if your goals are to be able to play on stages in small venues, actually make some money, I think that you'd be better served by practicing quietly. And lots of times the volume war starts with the drummer, where he's super loud, so everybody has to be loud alongside of him to hear themselves. And it can escalate from there. And I would say that I've seen an awful lot of drummers who are decent, average drummers who can play hard and fast. And or who play with a lot of metal, and that's really loud. But to me, the mark of a really excellent drummer is one who can play fairly soft and has good dynamics. So when they need to hit hard, they can hit hard. But when they don't need to hit hard, they don't. And they can well moderate their volume by hitting the metal gently while hitting the toms with a little more firm grip. And so if you can bring the drum level down, that gives the opportunity to bring the guitar levels down. And if you bring everything down to a rational level, then hearing yourself through the monitors, not such a deal. And if you come into the venue and you play the venue like you play a practice at ear-splitting level, you're probably not going to make a lot of friends. It's a challenging situation to mix a band that's really loud on stage. Whereas if you can keep your stage volumes nice and low and moderate, loud enough that you can hear what you're playing clearly and you don't have trouble playing, but letting the PA do the work, you'll make a lot more friends at the venue, you'll have better sounding shows, and you'll be more commercially viable. And so if you can practice at a moderate level, it's going to really help your transitions to playing live on stage and doing it commercially. Okay. Next point. It's only a 15-watt guitar amp. Well, bigger amps are louder, but are they that much louder? Here's an experiment for you. Get an MP3 player, a music player, plug it into your PA system, and then crank up a little bit of music and play it at a soft, moderate, comfortable listening level. You don't have to break any windows, you don't have to crank it up really high or anything, just a nice, reasonable level. So listen to that for a little bit and notice where the meters on the mixer are. Let's say they're fluttering around -20. Whatever they are. Now subtract 3 from that and push the master faders up until they're now hitting -17, 3 dB above where they just were. Notice the level change. That change in level would be the equivalent of going from a 15-watt amp to a 30-watt amp. Now nudge those levels up a little bit more, 3 more dB. And that would be like going from a 30-watt to a 60-watt. Now a 60-watt guitar amp is a pretty significant guitar amp. You can do probably any show that you'll need to do with a 60-watt amp. But hey, let's go for it. So nudge them another 3 dB. Now that would be the equivalent output compared to the first sound level we started at to jumping up to a 120-watt guitar amp. And that's about as big as you commonly see. 100 watts, a tube-type Marshall, you don't see a lot of amps much bigger than that. And you'll notice that from the volume you started out at to that 120-watt level, yeah, it's louder. It's noticeably louder. But it's not that much louder. Sound has a logarithmic curve to it that it takes a lot of input change to get a lot of perceptible output level difference. It's somewhat like athletes. In my old man, untoned condition, I'd have a heck of a time running a 100-meter dash. I'd post a lousy time. But if I really cared, I could exercise super hard, watch my diet, and in about 6 months I'd be in much better shape and I could make a huge improvement on my time. But I'd still be way behind an Olympic athlete. And I would have to try super, super hard to even approach the times of an Olympic athlete. But the amount of improvement I would make from today to 6 months would be pretty dramatic. And then it would be a smaller jump to reach the Olympic level. But it would be a whole lot more work. And that's kind of how the sound level is. It doesn't take a whole lot to get yourself into the game, but then each incremental change requires a whole lot more power. And so a 15-watt amp, it's pretty loud. And it's not that much quieter than a bigger amp. And so, the other issue is guitar amps can really compete with PA systems. 100 watts of Marshall amp can probably run with a pretty big PA system and keep up. So you could have 1,000 watts of PA that can have a challenge from a 100-watt guitar amp. And why is this? Well, it's because the signals are a little different. In a PA system, you need to reproduce a very wide frequency range from probably about 50 hertz up to 15,000 hertz. It's a very big wide band, and that energy is distributed amongst that whole big bandwidth. Whereas a guitar amplifier is a much narrower bandwidth, so it's kind of like, if you will, taking the garden hose, a wide spray versus a narrow spray. And when you squeeze up the band and put that same amount of energy into a smaller bandwidth, it's more intense. Probably the bigger factor, however, is the characteristics of the signal itself. With a PA amplifier reproducing full range music or speech. There are some really high peaks and a fairly moderate average level. And so we need like 1,000 watts of PA to cover those real high peaks that are up here, even though the system is running nominally at maybe 50 or 75 watts of output with these big peaks on top of it. Whereas a guitar amplifier, if you have 80 watts of guitar amplifier and you're playing some, crunchy metal guitar, there isn't that much difference between the average power and the peaks. And so you've got 80 or 100 watts of guitar signal, or even 15, but it's 15 watts all the time, solid, or 50 or 80 watts. So the power envelope in a guitar is not much different from its average to its peaks, and so it's a really high density, high energy signal, whereas the PA system might have an average power around where the guitar is, but the peaks rise above it for a very short period of time. And so that's why, a fairly small guitar amplifier can keep up with a pretty big PA system. Just a little different animal. In addition, oftentimes the PA system has to cover a very wide area. It has to have clean, well-controlled dispersion across the entire venue, whereas the guitar amplifier is a much more beamy signal, so people who are in front of the amplifier get pummeled with sound, and folks off to the sides don't get quite so much. So designing a good-sounding PA system is a little bit more of an engineering challenge than a guitar amplifier. And a guitar amplifier, because of its energy density, can keep up with a PA system. Okay, so back to your question. You're saying that you're peaking out the iNuke 6000 amplifier and you can still not really hear the vocals. I find that a little bit surprising, because I would think that if you're peaking out that amplifier, you're probably dealing with enough level in the room that I would expect the first constraint to be feedback from the mics, from the amount of output you're putting into the room. So it sounds to me like you're putting out a lot of energy, but you're not getting a whole lot of sound. Now, you mentioned that this is going into a PV Scorpion 800 watt speaker. I'm not sure what that is. When I think of the PV Scorpions, I'm thinking of a driver, an individual speaker driver. I don't know of a completed box called a Scorpion, but I don't claim to be an expert on all of the PV product line. So my first question is, what kind of speakers are you using in the PA system, really? And are those speakers very efficient? Changing the loudspeakers can have a dramatic impact on the amount of output the system has. Some speakers are fairly inefficient and some are very efficient, and the difference could be 10 dB, and 10 dB would be the equivalent of 10 times power change. So that is, speaker A would produce a certain amount of output at 1,000 watts, whereas speaker B, which is 10 dB more efficient, could produce the same amount of output with only 100 watts going in. So depending upon the speakers that you have attached to your amplifier can make a huge difference in the amount of output. So maybe that's the first thing as I would be looking at is, are those speakers really serving me well? I think I would suggest examining the speakers and making sure the guitars and everything aren't so crazy loud you just can't get on top of them. I'd probably put the guitars onto a stand so they're pointing up at your head and you don't have to fill the whole room with sound. You can just direct it where it needs to go. The other thing I would look at is, you mentioned you have the Behringer 6000 DSP model amplifier. The digital signal processing includes limiting, and so you can go to those pages and make sure that you're not prematurely limiting the output power of the amplifier. I think the limiting is a good feature to help keep you out of clipping, but you could have that thing possibly dialed up so that you're only getting a fraction of the power out of the amplifier before it hits hard limiting. The DSP version also gives you other features, of course, such as equalization and crossover abilities, so you don't have to use an external crossover, which I think is a cool feature. As for the mixing board and such, as long as you're getting clean signal at adequate level into the power amplifier, I don't think I can point the finger of blame at that. So those are the things I'd look at, and I wish I had a better suggestion for you. If I was looking at it in person, I could probably offer more advice, but based upon what I know, that's what I suggest. So take a look at the speakers that you're driving, those PV Scorpion 800s you mentioned. I don't know that one, and I would try swapping that out with a different box if you can and see if you get a better result. And maybe just positioning so that you're able to hear the output of that box better. Maybe different stage monitors would give you better monitoring. And like I say, I've used that amplifier for many band gigs, and it's always seemed adequate for small to medium shows for me, so it should be adequate for you as well. If you'd like to add anything, I'd be glad to address it further. Otherwise, I wish you well, and I'm curious as to what you find out. And so thanks for the comment, and we'll catch you all again soon on another episode.